insurance was the private sector. There were a few philanthropic organizations that were out there, but mainly for hospitalization. Most states had very little influence over benefit products. They didn't have state departments of insurance at that time. And the private sector kept the cost for health insurance fairly reasonable. In the 50s, healthcare was about 3% of the GDP. In the 60s, we had what? What came out of the 60s? Medicare and Medicaid, Great Society, okay? They added, Medicare was initially only for hospital services for the elderly, while Medicaid covered both clinic and certain hospital services for the poor. Medicare was funded through a payroll tax, while services under Medicaid were paid by the states and federal government. The way that was set up, it was a 50-50 deal. The government says, here's the minimum benefits you have to offer, we'll pay 50 cents and you pay 50 cents. In the late 70s, early 80s, states, because of the political need to want to get more votes, decided that they wanted to offer more benefits for Medicaid. So the government said, we'll give you a waiver called the 5501, and you can do more if you want. We're still going to give you 50 cents of the services that you should provide, but if you want to provide more, you can. Well, obviously, in order to get those services, you have to raise taxes because they're paid for through tax-based initiatives. So Medicaid was the first of the many unfunded mandates to the states. The private sector healthcare insurance products were still very affordable, with little or no annual inflationary increases. They had added benefits and included many new diagnostic tests as well, baby care. But as competition for providing health insurance grew, there was a rise in the creation of other private sector plans. There was also a time frame in which the U.S. saw the advent of self-funded and self-administered programs for larger employers. The federal government in the late 60s, early 70s passed a bill called the Hill-Burton Act, which provided federal funds to help build hospitals. The reason why you're seeing so many new hospitals built today is the first wave was built in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, and the life cycle of a hospital building is about 40 years, so now we're rebuilding. There have been more hospitals built in the United States in the last 5 years than there were during the Hill-Burton Act. Now, remember that number because he talked about the issue of utilization. So you now have all these new hospitals. I just came from Indiana, where in Fort Wayne they're building a brand new hospital. $1 billion for the hospital. Now, they put $100 million down, but they have to pay interest on $900 million, okay? And when that hospital opens, they've got to cover those costs somehow. So that's the kind of thing that's occurring out there. By the early 70s, healthcare was about 10% of our GDP. We then saw in the late 70s, early 80s, the rise of physician and hospital-sponsored products that were called health and maintenance organizations, or HMOs. They were not insurance products initially, and they were an attempt to compete with the insurance companies. Because these new HMOs did not fully understand the risk concept of insurance, they went bankrupt. And so what happened was the big players at that time bought them up and created insurance products from them, but they liked the concept, and so they carried that through into other programs. But because the HMOs, when they started, had added a lot of benefits that most of the carriers didn't have, when they pulled these HMOs in, and by the way, when the HMOs started, the majority of people that signed up for them were state workers, school teachers, and union groups, because the benefits were phenomenal and the cost to them was zero. So when the insurance companies pulled them into their product line, they kept the set benefit levels, so they raised their benefit levels to match those. And consequently, by the end of the 80s, healthcare was 14% of the GDP. In the early 90s, 4 things impacted benefits. First, baby boom population was now 50 years old. When you take a look at the curve of utilization, women start using healthcare about 19, 20, 21. And they're good about it. They go to the doctor for the annual physicals, they're very open with it, they talk to people about what's going on with their bodies, they're very familiar with that. Men, however, have to be dying before they go to the doctor. And even then, it's only if they're really gonna die will they go. But, what happened was when men turned 50, that changed. And when that happened in the early 90s. So what you have now is women utilization and men's utilization added onto that, so the curve went up almost straight up, right? Added to that, we had all these lifestyle drugs. Viagra, Cialis, Levitra, all of these mood drugs to make you feel better. I remember the commercial on TV with the lady swinging in the swing, and it said, if you want to feel like this, call 1-800-whatever. They didn't tell you what the drug was, all right? So they got 4 million phone calls for that drug that night. So what happened was we went into the baby boom generation does not age gracefully. They did not want to get old. And anything they could do to hold on to that youthfulness, they were doing. And we increased diagnostic testing, all kinds of things that we could do now. Instead of having an x-ray and an MRI. And so we saw, for the first time, healthcare start to really ramp up. And because the insurance companies were right behind it, and the employers were making good money, they just continued to feed that system, feed that system, feed that system. And you were still paying maybe a $10 copay, and that in of itself was a problem. You go to Best Buy or an audio place and you want to buy a TV, and there's 5 different brands ranging from $500 to $1,500 or $2,000, you're going to buy whatever your pocketbook can handle. But if I give you a card that says, hey, no matter what TV you buy, it's only $10, what are you going to buy? And that's what happened. By the end of the 90s, we also had a couple of things that occurred. We had Desert Storm, we started having more veterans starting to use veteran services, and because of the healthcare internal inflation rate was now running at 7 to 8%. 7 to 8%, and still is today, by the way. So healthcare as a part of the GDP, by the end of the turn of the century, 2000, was about 17%, 70% of the GDP. Now, all through this, even though healthcare was inflating, healthcare products were able to keep up until about 1995 their inflation rate to about 2%. But they couldn't do it anymore. They had built up huge reserves over the years. And again, for those of you who understand a little bit about the actual science of reserving, insurance companies have to reserve a huge amount of money, even though it's maybe 5 times more they can ever pay out. But that's what happens. Departments of insurance require this. So they have all these reserves built up. And in order to stay competitive, as the inflationary costs started to ratchet up, they started to eat through the reserves in order to keep their premiums low, to keep their members. But eventually they had to stop that and start to raise prices. So from 1995 on, you started to see healthcare inflation occur. But in order to keep that contained, they created new products. Health savings accounts, HSAs. And what they did there was shift the risk. So now instead of you having a $10 copay and a $50 deductible, you have a $25 copay and a $1,200 deductible. Okay? But your premiums are still the same. All right? So many people today now have HSAs, $5,500 deductibles, in order to keep your premiums relatively low. So that's what's happened. That's how the insurance industry has met the inflationary cost of the delivery system. So the current estimate is we look into the year 2012, if nothing changes on the inflationary aspect of the healthcare system, you're going to see healthcare in this country quickly approaching about 20% of the GDP. Now, it's interesting, if you look at Europe, Europe runs about 7% of the GDP. But the European system operates fairly different than ours, and because it never started out the same way ours did, and because it doesn't have the same cost of delivery, it doesn't have the same issue in terms of its percent of GDP. If you, for example, if you want to buy a drug in the United States, it may be $400 a month. The same drug in Europe may be 10. Okay? For those of you who know what a stent is, a little plastic and spring that goes in your artery, the cost to a hospital is about $2,000. The covered one's about $6,000. Cost to manufacture, $20. And so what's happened is we're paying for all the R&D in the United States.